Hello and welcome back to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. And apologies if my audio is less clear since I'm recovering from a cold. I'll be demonstrating on how to paint a heap of pumpkins in a very freestyle manner. And the painting size is A5 and I'm using cold pressed watercolor paper from Canson, 300 grams per square meter. And my main brush is going to be Da Vinci Casaneo Mob style. Alternatively, you can use any round style Bristol brush as long as it ranges between size 6 to 8. And I'm going to kickstart the painting using the wet on dry technique. So it's wet paint on dry surface of the paper, and most of the time I am going to be using this technique. So the first shade is going to be a light looking green shade, whereby I have mixed permanent green with a hint of Indian yellow. So the Indian yellow shade adds some vibrancy to the green shade, as if I painted fully solely with the green shade, it might look a bit too dull or dark in color, and I want some brightness in this green shade pumpkin. So the second color is going to be of orange shade. I mixed cadmium red with some Indian yellow to arrive at this color mix. And I'm just randomly painting shapes. I forgot to mention earlier in this video that the heap of pumpkins can be of aerial view or side view. It doesn't matter. You're just going to paint random shapes of pumpkin, uneven shape, because pumpkins are not in a very perfect shape as in sphere or oval. It can be uneven shapes. So just paint that random shapes here and there. Since this is a freestyle painting, so you don't want to worry too much about the shapes, and just have fun painting all this random composition of the pumpkins in a heap. So moving on to the next shade, which is purely the Indian yellow, and once again I am just painting the shapes of the pumpkins here and there next to the painted ones. It's okay if the previous painted pumpkin shades bleed into the new wet paint. It doesn't matter. All these accidents, the main element in a freestyle painting. Well, it may look like an abstract painting at this stage, but as we progress and build up the layers and details, then you will get to see the pumpkin images. So the next shade is burnt sienna with a hint of Indian yellow. It may look like the orange shade, but this is a much more dull shade, since burnt sienna is more brown in color. And as you paint, remember to make variations in the sizes and shapes of the pumpkin to add more character in this heap of pumpkins. You don't want everything to look the same. So the next shade of pumpkin is a much darker in tone, as I do not want it to look very monotonous, the entire painting to look monotonous. So I've decided to add in some darker values. So I've mixed some indigo with the green shade that I had earlier. Alright, done with the deep tone. Now I felt that I need a brighter tone, so I've decided to use some permanent carmine with a hint of Indian yellow, just to tone down that brightness of the deep red shade. I'm just painting that in, and since this color is much brighter and deep, you can overlap some of the pumpkin painting by painting them over the other dried pumpkin images. So basically this is the last shade of this pumpkin heap painting, and before you let it completely to dry, if you have some corrections to do, go ahead before you allow it to dry completely. So I will have to lift out some pigment from the dry painting in order to reveal the stem details on the pumpkin. In order to do that, I'm using a micro brush by dipping it in clean water and removing the excess water on a dry paper towel. And then with that damp brush, I am just brushing over the dry paint and lifting it out using a dry paper towel as well. So this is a very common technique in creating some highlights or brightness in the some part of your painting, especially when your painting size is small and you cannot avoid that small size painting from painting it over with a wet paint. So might as well just paint them and allow it to dry and then lift it out gently. And as you lift out the pigments, do remember to make it appear randomly on the pumpkin images as well. It doesn't have to appear at the center part of the pumpkin. It can be on the top, sideways, so that it gives us a variety in the positioning of the pumpkin on the entire heap. So moving on to the details on the pumpkin, I am right now using purely Sapphire shade and using the wet on dry technique and painting using my micro brush once again. I'm just painting the ribs, the carving like pattern which we call ribs on the pumpkin. So apply the wet paint onto the dry surface of the pumpkin image, and after painting them in, I'm going to give them some washes, gentle washes using a damp brush so that it appears much softer. As I zoom in, you notice that the damp brush application softens the hard edges of the lines that I've painted earlier. So I'm using the same Sapphire shade to paint in these details, similar details, which is the ribs of the pumpkin on the pumpkins that have this brownish shade. And once done, once again, I am giving them some light washes using the clean damp brush. So basically I'm going to repeat this process for a few pumpkins, but the shades may vary. Done with the brown shade pumpkins, right now I am using the indigo shade that I had earlier with a hint of that permanent green paint. I'm just painting that over the light green shade pumpkins and just painting it over in a form of stripes or uneven lines to reveal the lighter shade beneath it. And as I paint these details, you may be wondering, why does it look like a watermelon? Yes, I do feel the same way. It looks like watermelon, but there are pumpkins. There is a pumpkin that looks similar to watermelon's skin. So keep painting the details. You can even create some dots or scribbles using the micro brush. And since this pumpkin is quite bright in nature, so I have decided not to give it some light washes with a damp brush compared to the earlier brown shade pumpkins. And moving on to the yellow shaded pumpkins, I have decided to paint in the ribs details using an orange shade. As I mentioned earlier, you can mix your red with a little hint of yellow, bright yellow, to arrive at this shade. And after applying the paint, I have decided to soften its look by applying light washes using the clean damp brush. And as I mentioned earlier, do create the details in a very freestyle manner, as in angles and positioning of the details, so that it doesn't appear flat and it speaks an impression of a busy image, as in the pumpkins. Each pumpkins are at a different perspective, as in some are laid sideways, upside down and so on. So for the next pumpkin, I've decided to use the wet on wet technique, whereby I have pre-wet the image, the orange shade pumpkin, with some clean water and then applying wet paint onto it, just like what I'm doing over here. So it gives you a very smooth and soft look in nature. As I mentioned earlier, more variations brings a strong character into your entire painting. So I'm going to repeat this wet on wet technique onto the dark shade pumpkins. So once again, as you can see, after pre-wetting the surface of the pumpkin image, I am applying the indigo wet paint to create that soft details. As for the bright red pumpkins, I have decided to use a burgundy shade to paint in the ribs, and I'm doing this using the wet on dry technique. So it's basically wet paint on the dry painting and giving it some light washes after that. Alright, in order for the pumpkins to stand out, I'm painting the stems using a mix of burnt sienna with ochre to arrive at this light shaded brown, and painting in at different angles. Like I said, we need to create a variation in the looks of the pumpkin. You can even drop in some additional colors, as in burnt umber or sapphire, into the stem painting to add more variations in the shades, tonal values. So right now I am using a script brush which has a much more fine bristle to paint in the tendrils, the part where it looks like threads or spring on the stems of the pumpkin. So once you've completed the pumpkin painting, you will notice there are white gaps, the unpainted areas. So I am going to fill in the white gaps, unpainted areas, with sapphire, and just applying the wet paint onto the dry areas, and then on some part I am just giving it some light washes to avoid the harsh edges. And to paint in these narrow areas, it is recommended to use the micro brush or script brush. You can paint in these gaps with any color of your choice, preferably darker shades, as the heaps would create shadow effect. So you can go with a gray shade or indigo itself, or maybe a deep green that is not bright, if you are not a fan of sapphire or burnt umber. So I definitely need some paint spatters. Watercolor painting is incomplete without paint spatters, right? I'm a big fan of spatters. And after creating these spatters, I'm just spraying in with some clean water to let the spatters do their thing, and you can control bigger spatters with your damp brush. So as I commonly do this in most of my watercolor paintings, I need some popping highlights, and in order to do this I am using Pit Pastel from Faber-Castell in white shade to just lightly draw in some highlight effects or some shine on the pumpkin stem and skin. If you don't prefer to use any kind of pastel or dry medium, you can use a gouache paint, white gouache paint, or acrylic paint in order to achieve this effect. And if you are not a fan of these popping highlights, then you can stop right away and the painting is complete. A little bit more and we're done with the entire painting. So how do you like this colorful heap of pumpkin? So if you find this tutorial fun and educational, then do hit the like and share button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Thanks for watching and see you in another video. Bye.